Imagine a future where everything as we know it, from governments and power to health and safety, is transformed. 2 days ago, the world was introduced to a book that unearths this looming reality. But what if I told you I got a glimpse of it a bit earlier?
Artificial intelligence is making a huge splash.
The urgent new warning.
We could have potentially a catastrophic outcome.
If we produce things that are more intelligent than us, how do we know we can keep control?
It says mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority.
My worst fears are that we cause significant harm to the world.
Hey, it's Nabil, and today we're diving deep into The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman. And this isn't just any copy I'm holding here. This is a pre-released edition signed by the AI insider himself. I had the privilege of meeting the co-founder of DeepMind at a conference not too long ago. And although it was brief, I was lucky enough to get a sneak peek into what promises to be one of the most revelatory books in the space today. All right, so what makes this different from your typical doomsday sort of nonfiction book? Well, I've read it and reread some parts of it more than once. And what Suleyman does here is actually pretty unique. So what he does is he peels back the layers on some topics that, most of us have heard of if you're even mildly into tech or AI. And he pieces them together in unexpected ways or theories. He sort of does these mind experiments. And where it gets really interesting is that where you might find gaps in your knowledge, he fills them with questions and topics that usually are just sort of reserved to the top researchers in AI. We're on the precipice of a future where AI and similar technologies aren't just features. They're the core fabric of our existence. And the book describes just that, a world teetering between unparalleled innovation and potential disaster. I invite you to join me not just on a summary of a book, but a discussion on what's coming and why it's crucial we pay attention. Welcome to a discourse on the coming wave. Let's dive in.
It will transform how the world works.
All right, so the book is split into 3 parts. But before we even get into those, we have a chapter called Containment is Not Possible, which really introduces the book and sets us up for reading it with a purpose. So we're first introduced to the concept of waves, which is how the author really views the spread of technology and really anything throughout history. So I'll read you a few quotes here. So waves have been just as transformative, the rise and fall of empires, religions, bursts of commerce. And he really compares this to tech, and he says that the rise and spread of technologies has also taken the form of world-changing waves, something that spreads very quickly and like a wave sort of is exponential. And we'll get into this a bit further on. But he goes on to talk about what defines the coming wave, and this is really what structures the whole book. It really is 2 technologies, artificial intelligence, or AI, and synthetic biology. And this is where things get really interesting because we're not just talking about AI, but this is the co-founder of DeepMind. So we're really intrigued to learn more about how he thinks AI can complement other technologies and other discoveries in this coming wave. And so we continue on with a dilemma, and I'll read you a quote as well. The core dilemma is that sooner or later, a powerful generation of technology leads humanity toward either catastrophic or dystopian outcomes. It's not a great start, but we learn a bit more and we get into where he's coming from with this dilemma as he exposes his thesis. And this is where we learn that in tech or policy circles, it quickly becomes obvious that head in the sand is the default ideology when it comes to, and this is not me reading the quote anymore, but when it comes to examining the downsides or the potential negative consequences of technologies like AI and synthetic biology. He continues on to say that in the face of the coming wave and the great dilemma, and in the face of a pessimism-averse techno-elite, none of this is enough. And we get to finally his argument, which is that without containment, every other aspect of technology, every discussion of its ethical shortcomings or the benefits it would bring is inconsequential. And that we urgently need watertight answers to how the coming wave can be controlled and contained. This is very interesting because when you're first exposed to this chapter, it's hard to grasp how inconsequential the benefits of tech like AI can be when we ignore or sort of downplay the downsides, because we hear a lot about the power of AI, of synthetic biology and other advances of tech in the news. And the headlines we get that are more sort of fear-mongering or around the downsides are typically very distant, right? We hear about potential doomsday scenarios, but we imagine them to be very far off. But when we talk about the potential benefits and we use tools like ChatGPT, these are much closer to us. All right, let's get into part 1. So this part is really all about looking at the history of tech and seeing how new advances in technology have spread before, what drove the spread of technology, how it happened and in what way, and especially looking at generalized technology and seeing how something that can start out niched, like a new advancement or a new discovery, becomes widespread and becomes used in many different fields. And this is a key characteristic of tech that the author reuses later on, and you'll see why when we keep going. The main exploration comes towards the end of this part, where we look at if history shows that humanity has ever said no to a technology. So let's dive right in with a quote. "Instead of turning away from technologies, the past is marked by a pronounced pattern of proliferation, resulting in sprawling chains of both intended and unintended consequences, leading to containment problems like keeping control of new technologies even when they become sort of cheap or mass adopted." And this is the key. So the first chapter is called Endless Proliferation. And sort of in line with what we just said, it really goes into an example to kickstart the whole argument, which is the engine. And it talks about how the engine was a great example of how tech spreads and grows, and how this is an inevitable trajectory that all new advances take. It continues on with other examples like Moore's Law, which, if you don't know, is essentially a take on processing power and computing power and how it's exponential, right? So it really goes into technology's historical norm, which is to grow exponentially and to like a wave, spread exponentially, not in a linear fashion. And so this brings us to the next chapter in this part, which is about containment, and it's actually called the containment problem. So this is where the author shows us how hard and how rare it has been in the past to meaningfully stay in control of a technology after it's become widespread, after the wave it was a part of has sort of taken its course. And this is where we take a look at the past to see if humanity has ever successfully or not just tried saying no to a technology or pausing its development or its spread. And the consensus, and you probably sort of see this coming, is that we haven't successfully done so before. So we've tried a lot. We have the example of the crossbow that comes up, and there's a quote there that says that once established, waves are almost impossible to stop, using that example. But then he delves into a very interesting topic that he calls the nuclear exception, but with a question mark. And the question mark says everything here, and this is a sort of subtitle in the book. And the reason behind this is that we are looking at nuclear advances and nuclear technology as something that has been contained, right? Like this is something that going into the book, even reading the first part of this chapter, I'm like, okay, yeah, that is an exception. That is a time where humanity has said no to a technology and contained it or sort of controlled it. But we quickly realized that there have been accidents or near catastrophes. And these are coming from headlines from news that perhaps you've heard of, perhaps I have heard of, but reading it all together like this, under the context of it being the only time humanity has tried saying no at scale, is incredibly powerful, because you realize that even with a technology as powerful as this, even with something like this, containment wasn't fully successful or possible. And I'll read you a quote. "The worrying truth of this fearsome technology is that humanity has tried to say no, and only partially succeeded. Nuclear weapons are among the most contained technologies in history, and yet the containment problem, in its hardest, most literal sense, even here, remains acutely unsolved." Whew, feels like we need a break after this. That's actually how the whole book feels. Like you read it and you process something as you read it, and you feel like you need to take a step back and be like, oh, okay, that's a thing. Okay, anyway. On to part 2. This section of the book really focuses on the coming wave and explaining it. So the author really delves into AI, artificial intelligence, the first part of the coming wave, and synthetic biology, looking into the power of each, the origins, and why each is so hard to contain. Now, he also looks into complementary tech. So think of quantum computing and robotics, and he does the same for those. So altogether, it's really an interesting deep dive into each of these technologies. And for someone like me who's genuinely curious about these and has some tidbits within each, it really felt comprehensive, and it felt like I was learning something new, at least when it's all put together. The interesting thing is that the main point of the whole part is to show you that all of these technologies, the complementary ones and the two that are at the core of the wave, they all share, quote, 4 key characteristics or features that explain why this isn't business as usual. They are inherently general and therefore omni-use. They hyper-evolve. They have asymmetric impacts. And in some respects, they are increasingly autonomous. So chapter 4, the technology of intelligence, so you've guessed it, AI, really goes through the most insider part of the book, in my opinion, because this is the co-founder of DeepMind, and it really takes us through a journey of AI from the perspective of someone that was founding a big initiative within it, right? And so we start by talking about the success of DQN, which is an algorithm that was successfully trained to learn to play games really well. And we're told that the big shift here and the sort of revolutionary aspect was the self-learning. This was really the first time self-learning was done by a system so successfully. Next, we learn about the remarkable leap from this to AlphaGo, which was a more public version of this. Essentially, AlphaGo was a system that publicly beat a player at a game, the top player essentially in that game, and it was very public and mediatized. And so this is the first time it got that much attention. And so these two are used to introduce the concept of humanity going from always trying to manipulate atoms in the physical space, like a lot of tech and developments in printing and the engine and the wheel and things like that are really physical, into the world of bits, the digital world. And this is where there's a hint towards the next technology of the wave. He also talks about moving towards genes and synthetic biology. This is where the author takes an important pause to argue that the book and this section and really all of his argument goes beyond buzzwords. It may seem like the timing of the book is within a hype cycle, and it may seem that some of the arguments are based around or in the context of a hype cycle, but I think this chapter is really important, especially coming from someone that has been cynical of hype cycles a lot. And my personal experience, you'll see on my channel, I talk about sort of my business experience and my entrepreneurship experience and just my learnings. And often I am cynical of hype cycles, but this is a super interesting take. Because essentially, he mentions that the progress of these technologies is not only visible, but accelerating at a pace that is clearly exponential. And that this is not something that increased VC attention or increased media attention can take away from in any way, shape, or form. He also mentions that, hype cycles, and I'll add to this myself, are typically the start of any meaningful change in society or new advancement. You need that explosion of interest for funding to go into something, for interest to go into something, which would drive its further advancement. And this is really important because it brings us to a part where he talks about the AI spring, or the coming of age of deep learning. Essentially, it's all about the success of AlexNet, which was the resurgence of deep learning. And this was a system that was trained on a large amount of data, which really is what deep learning is all about. He also then goes on to talk about large language models, which we've seen an exponential rise of with ChatGPT and other technologies. And he mentions and takes away from that AI is essentially eating the world. This is really the chapter where we feel his insider of the world of AI perspective, beyond just sharing his journey and his work, because he really gives his take on how they are revolutionary and how they are impactful. He, for example, defines artificial general intelligence in a way that we can all grasp. So it's essentially a type of AI that can handle a wide range of complex tasks, sort of more like a human, because that's, at the end of the day, that's what AI is trying to do, is to emulate humans with machines. And so this would be the ultimate form of that being achieved. But you really feel like this is coming from someone that has been in this space. Chapter 5 is about the technology of life, and this is where the author really gets into biology, which he calls, quote, the universe's most ancient technology. But more precisely, he goes into synthetic biology, and he talks about technologies like CRISPR and how they've evolved. But he argues that it's just the start, and that gene synthesis, like printing strands of DNA, editing is no longer just what you can do. You can start writing DNA, and so he really goes into how all of that ties into the coming wave. Chapter 6 goes even wider and talks about quantum computing, robotics, and the energy transition, and how all of these together form the coming wave. And this is going to be crucial to the other parts of the book that talk about where we're going. He even talks about a wider wave that could be coming after this wave. And this is sort of looking a bit further with breakthroughs like advanced nanotechnology, which, quote, takes the ever-growing precision of technology to its logical conclusion. So really tremendous stuff And in chapter 7, it all comes together. Because in chapter 7 is when we talk about the 4 features of the coming wave and what makes it so different, so powerful, and so hard to contain. So the 4 features. 1 is asymmetric impact. So we're talking about colossal transfers of power. And a lot of the examples are centered around wars and conflicts, but there are other uses and other applications that are super interesting to read. The second feature of this coming wave is hyper-evolution. We are talking about exponential discoveries, exponential advancements, with examples that are honestly mind-blowing. So one of them that really stuck out to me was AlphaFold by Google. And so essentially before, to create a 3D map of a protein, it used to take months or even years for researchers to just map one protein. And with AlphaFold, it took seconds. And AI was able to sort of learn from a bunch of proteins that we had already mapped as humans, and sort of just apply that to literally every protein that is known to science. And that's just mind-blowing, right? And so these examples of catalyzing biotech and other fields, for example, show how the evolution is quick and it is just at a scale that is unparalleled. The third feature of the coming wave is omni-use. So we talk about a lot of drug discovery, we talk about a lot of health advancements, but there's also a lot of other applications of the coming wave and its technologies. And so this is really a feature about general purpose technologies. Lastly, the fourth feature is autonomy. It seems like these systems that are part of this coming wave are increasingly autonomous, and it is hard to know if humans will ever be in the loop. So when you get an output from ChatGPT, for example, and it feels like a black box and you can't really explore the reasoning behind it, imagine if AI actually leapfrogged us and was able to solve problems and create outputs that humans can't even do. Imagine how much more impactful and how much more of a challenge this would be in this case. Now, chapter 8 is about incentives, and it's called Unstoppable Incentives for a reason. These incentives are very strong and they're very far-reaching. So the first one he talks about is national security, this strategic necessity to have an advantage and national pride. And so what he starts very strongly with is this concept of an arms race. So he talks about how when he founded and worked at DeepMind, he always rejected a comparison to the Manhattan Project. And if you're not familiar, that's essentially the race to develop nuclear weapons. And that's something he rejected, not just because nuclear power was nefarious in a way, but also because for him, being compared to that sort of meant that the race towards AI is a competitive one. And that sort of takes away the needed cooperation and pause and sort of collaboration between many different actors that for him is necessary for responsible development of AI. That said, he does admit the contrary. And I have a very interesting quote here that he uses to summarize the perspective of most people. Even if we are not actually in an arms race, we must assume they think we are. And therefore we must ourselves race to achieve a decisive strategic advantage, since this new technological wave might completely rebalance global power. And so this is super interesting because it means that even though fundamentally this might not be an arms race, and even though from the perspective of leaders like himself, this shouldn't be an arms race, it unfortunately might end up just being it. And he goes even further. He says that, quote, "The logic of nation states is painfully simple and yet utterly inevitable." And so in the context of nation states' national security, merely floating an idea becomes dangerous. And this is what's happening in this case. Next, we get 2 more sort of negative incentives and then a very optimistic one, actually. So the 2 are, of course, money. There's a whole part called the $100 trillion opportunity with a lot of shocking statistics and realities that, again, you might have heard floating around, but combined just are utterly incredible. And then, of course, he talks about ego. And I think there's just this concept that we're all very aware of is anytime there's been an advance in technology or anytime society as a whole or humanity has advanced, it's because one person wanted to advance themselves. And so ego is incredibly powerful in this case. And he talks about how it's not just technologists, it's also scientists wanting prestige and publications. And this sort of brings us to the last more positive incentive, which is simply curiosity. And he has a part called knowledge wants to be free, and this is really about raw curiosity truth-seeking, and how these can also be powerful incentives. So part 3 is really where things get interesting, because it feels like in parts 1 and 2 you're just playing catch up and you're learning new things that you need to understand to get to the thought exercises that are coming. But part 3 is where it gets creative. So essentially what he's doing here, the author, is exploring the consequences of this colossal redistribution of power. And what he argues is that the nation state, which is, quote, supposedly the most capable actor in containing technology, will be further weakened by shocks amplified by the wave. And so the part is very interesting because beyond discussing typical implications like job automation, Suleyman actually details how new forms of violence could evolve and how catastrophic accidents aren't unlikely. He argues that, quote, the wave forces a set of tectonic shifts in power, both centralizing and decentralizing at the same time. But his point is that, quote, this could empower groups and movements to live outside the social structures that exist, which brings us to the big dilemma. So chapter 9, called The Grand Bargain, starts by outlining the promise of the state, which is that it, quote, offers citizens a simple and highly persuasive bargain that not only is centralization of power in the sovereign state or territorial state possible, but its benefits far outweigh the risks. And what he essentially does is that he starts envisioning a world where the coming waves comes and sort of shocks that and completely puts into question the grand bargain. He details his personal experience working in politics in Copenhagen and London, discusses how the realities on the ground are often very different from what's going on in political discourse. He talks about how hard it is to find middle ground or any common ground at all. And he gets to a very important passage, and I'll read the exact quote here because it is that powerful. An influential minority in the tech industry not only believes that new technologies pose a threat to our ordered world of nation states, this group actively welcomes its demise. These critics believe that the state is mostly in the way, and they argue that it's best jettisoned, it is beyond rescue. So the author fundamentally disagrees, and he says this in black and white. He thinks that, quote, such an outcome would be a disaster. But he goes on to very interestingly detail how nation states are actually fragile, and that nowadays the core of these nation states, which is trust, is actually being lost, and that trust in institutions and social mobility and all these concepts are being lost. And next he talks about how technology is political, and that the whole argument that, quote, technology is value neutral and that its politics arise from its use is actually weak and inconclusive, and it doesn't make sense. And this is where we get to chapter 10, where everything is really put together with regards to this grand bargain being weakened, where we talk about fragility amplifiers. And this is where the author details how the coming wave has many different characteristics and effects that fully and directly weaken the nation state. So we start out with a story of WannaCry, which is a sort of national emergency that happened where in 2017, the NHS had a cyber attack alongside other organizations that relied on a Microsoft system. And the patch and solution was actually just someone buying a domain name randomly that they found was part of the vulnerability, which sort of fixed it. But essentially the discussion is around how powerful a corporation like Microsoft was in this situation and how reliant we were on tech, and how this is a huge weak point of the nation state. He also talks about the plummeting cost of power. Of course, when a wave becomes more widespread and technology becomes more adopted, costs go down. He gets deeper into violence as well, talking about how AI combined with robotics in war can be just game-changing. He also talks about misinformation and about deepfakes and gives concrete examples of each. It's a really eye-opening passage. He also talks about how state-sponsored misinformation campaigns have very tangible consequences. He talks about lab leaks, and it's all really consequential, the way it's written, the facts that are presented, all of it. I think that the biology part was actually the most powerful for me coming out of a pandemic. We feel really close to such topics, and the fact that, and these are, I'm paraphrasing, but the fact that a unlabeled petri dish or an accidental vial dropping on the floor could quite literally end the world is pretty mind-boggling. And we end on the automation debate, which he has a very refreshing, honest take on, where he's not even arguing about the extent of it. So he's not saying that, new jobs will be created to compensate for those that are gone or anything like that. He's actually just refreshingly honest by saying that the goal is simply to show you the reader that it is a fragility amplifier, that it just goes to directly weaken the nation state. The goal is not to tell you about the extent of it. All right, now we're at chapter 11 and we're nearing the end of the book. So we're naturally turning towards the future a lot more than we did before. This chapter is about the future of nations. The nations that we just talked about are fragile and being weakened. And so we start out by learning about corporations, and the author talks about Apple, for example, that has reaped tremendous returns on intelligence that's compounding and that has more power than some countries right now. Beyond that, he also talks about surveillance, which is becoming a huge part of many countries. I'm paraphrasing, but it essentially goes, if AI, biotech, quantum, robotics, and the rest of the coming wave are centralized in the hands of a repressive state, the resulting entity would be palpably different from any yet seen, which raises the prospect of totalitarianism to a new plane. Another thought exercise that I found super interesting here is on the exact opposite, which is decentralization of power. And essentially the author touches upon today's geopolitical realities in some region, and he thinks of a potential opposite of centralization, where a combination of AI, cheap robotics, an advancement in biotech, and cheap power and energy could make small state-like entities a lot more powerful and possible. And this goes back to what we said about sort of living off the grid and outside the typical social structures. He then goes on to define the future as contradictory, because we just talked about centralization of power and decentralization as two plausible, very realistic scenarios according to the author. And here it's really about looking at it as a wave again. For him, the future is about a bunch of trajectories coming together and happening at the same time. So he really thinks that centralization of power can happen simultaneously as power becomes more decentralized as well, which he thinks leads us to the most consequential and biggest dilemma of the 21st century. And I quote, "Leaving us with no good options would be technology's ultimate failure. Yet this is precisely where we are heading." So chapter 12 is about this dilemma between dystopia and catastrophe. And the author starts it out by highlighting that the ultimate failure of catastrophe, that scenario itself, is not just possible, but impossible to deny. And he argues that those who dismiss this scenario are actually discounting the objective facts that lay before us. He goes on to describe varieties of catastrophes, sort of a thought exercise into what catastrophe could look like in the coming wave once it's actually reached its peak. There are a bunch of honestly creative but kind of make sense scenarios that come up here. One popular one is the genie in a bottle sort of metaphor, which is you get what you asked for, not what you want. And so you can think of telling a very powerful AI that's connected to robotics and the rest of the world that you want a prediction of the economy in 10 years, and that it realizes that it can get a super accurate one by taking up every computer on Earth and using that computation power to calculate, an economic prediction, and that it kills all humans to get to that point and take over every computer. So these are all catastrophe scenarios that are described in the book, some of which have been mediatized and given more attention to, and others that are really creative but interesting to read and make sense. Lastly, I will say that there are other dystopian terms that are mentioned here. One very interesting one is stagnation, which means pausing technology or stopping, and sort of a society deciding, okay, this is probably turning towards a negative outcome, let's just stop. And the author really does a good job of showing us that it is worth exploring this option because it says a lot about humans. Essentially, the way the author describes this is that the societies we live in give a sense of permanence, right? You go to the supermarket, you expect food to be there. You look at skyscrapers and downtowns, and all of this screams, this is the standard of living that we're in right now. But the reality is that this all depends on constant economic growth. And economic growth can't just endlessly go up without any technological advancement. And so he really argues that even maintaining the standards of living that we are used to and what we live with right now requires technological advancement. And so the logical next question is, what's next? What happens next now that we have realized this? And this is where we get into part 4. All right, so part 4 is really where the whole book comes together, where the main value add of this Google DeepMind founder comes in, and really where we start to look at the future. and Containment. And so chapter 13, called Containment Must Be Possible, really sets up what the author thinks is a good path forward, or a promising one, with a quite negative view. So in this chapter, he talks about how on the surface and the way things are looking right now, containment doesn't seem possible. It doesn't seem feasible or realistic. And this is, again, coming from an expert or an insider. So as a reader, you start up with a very negative, pessimistic outlook. However, he does detail how, for our sake as a society, it must be possible, and how something must be done if we want a shot at containing this. And this is where he level sets with us as readers and sets up his next chapter, chapter 14, where he outlines the steps for containment. Now, the steps for containment are promising avenues for improving different areas of the coming wave, or at least setting up guardrails for each area. So remember, we talked about omni-use and autonomy as key factors of the coming wave. Well, in this chapter, chapter 14, each step is really oriented towards one or a few of these areas and solving for each of those. And really what the author is trying to get to is that collectively doing all of these things, or a bunch of these things in different ways and at the same time, can get us towards some form of containment. An important thing to note is his view on regulation. It's very direct. He clearly thinks that regulation isn't enough. He thinks that what's going on right now is a lot of deflection. So private sector and public sector actors sort of deflecting towards, oh, we just need regulation, we're all for regulation. Whereas in his view, it's never enough. So I'll let you read the book if you're interested in these steps for containment. I feel like that's the main value add of reading it. And I'll now tell you about my thoughts on the book and the review. So to start off, I'll credit the author with being honest about his take. He knows he's presenting something very negative. He knows that he's sort of fear-mongering with the facts that he's presenting, or at least the narrative that he's creating. But at least he's upfront about it. And he's also upfront about why he's doing it. He thinks that the current narrative around these technologies isn't nearly pessimistic enough, or at least cautious enough. And he thinks that by providing this, I don't want to call it an extreme, but this very strong viewpoint, he can level things out, or at least for the reader, create this discovery or this realization that really this side exists and this narrative is valid, or at least has some merit. Then he gets into thought experiments and his sort of suggestions towards the end, which is what we just covered in part 4. This, to me, is the value of getting someone that's so entrenched in the area speak to something. He is the founder of one of the largest organizations, the most respected organizations in this space. And this is where it's interesting to read where he takes things. Now, are some thought experiments a bit cynical, a bit extreme? Yes, absolutely. But that's the point of a thought experiment. So it's interesting to hear someone go there, and for him to be an insider and go there, you're like, okay, these aren't necessarily conspiracy theories. They're actually somewhat plausible, or at least worth considering. And this is where I took a step back after reading the book, and I realized that his alarmist attitude, which does sell more books and gets more clicks online and what have you, all these critiques are super valid, but his alarmist attitude could be justified because he's honest about it, he thinks it's needed, and it's part of his whole argument. So where I think my main issue with the book lies, and where most people will have issue with the book, is this fear-mongering and this alarmist attitude. But again, you have to take a step back and realize that that's the whole point. And I will say the big piece here is that we read a lot of headlines that are about job automation and job losses and things like that directly affect people, and those get us talking and get us asking questions. But the things about lab leaks and those very scientific or technical headlines, they don't nearly cause as much discussion or interest. And the benefit of this book is that it's taking these headlines that maybe wouldn't garner attention and putting them together so that we non-experts realize the weight of these things put together and actually think about them. And that's the whole point to me. The examples are also very varied, they're worldly, they're rich. It's clearly someone that's not boggled down or narrowed by one culture. It didn't feel like I was reading a tech bro's account or biography. It really felt diverse in the examples within tech, obviously. In this case, the new way of seeing things is just putting things together and realizing their weight more than anything else. and realizing that some thought experiments that may seem extreme actually are worth thinking about. So that's really my review. It's tough to criticize anything when he's so straightforward and honest about the aspects of the book that you would criticize. I will say, and this is the point, if he actually wanted to make this more widespread or more mainstream as a discussion, as a book and as a topic, he would make it more concise. I'm a fan of longer books if the examples that make them longer are worth thinking about and worth reading, but that's really the only thing I can criticize. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you for watching. If you've made it this far, please consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next video.